Hey,
Choosing or settling on a palette as a painter, especially when you're just getting started, can be difficult, daunting, confusing, simply for the sheer number of possibilities that are out there and innumerable colors you can choose from. Like, do you go with a maximalist palette that has every possible color you could imagine, and even some you can't? Do you go with a split temperature palette that has a warm and cool version of each color? Do you go with a matrix palette? Barbie's Malibu Pink Special Surprise palette? A palette that really represents your soul? Or do you look to simplify things and seek out a limited palette? Today we'll be taking a look at 3 of the most popular limited palettes out there, each one containing only 4 paints, and we'll paint the same exact portraits with each palette and then compare the results at the end. Will we be able to decide on a winner? Or will each one work in its own unique way? Before we get started painting, let's dive a little deeper into the land of color and see just what it takes to make a limited palette. It's in the name. By virtue of it being a limited palette, no matter what, we're going to be sacrificing something. And whatever colors they are that you're getting rid of determines what it is you're giving up. And different people, based on their own personal tastes and styles, have different ideas of what it is they're willing to sacrifice in a palette. But more on that later. Every successful, versatile, limited palette basically relies on maintaining 2 things. A good value range. Can you get reasonably bright and reasonably dark? Thank you. And having a good temperature range. Can you get reasonably warm and reasonably cool? And if your palette can cover all of those different ranges, you're going to be able to approach some form of realism. Now, is it necessary to have absolutely perfect primaries? Not at all, so long as there's harmony among the colors that you choose. So now let's take a look at the first palette we'll be using. Now this one is probably the most iconic one, the one most people are likely to think of when they hear the term limited palette, and that's the Zorn palette, made famous by 19th century Swedish painter Anders Zorn. And it's comprised of titanium white, the white we'll use for every palette, yellow ochre, vermilion, and ivory black. Now this one might be the most interesting one as well, in that of all the palettes that we'll look at, it's the one that deviates the furthest from having what we'd think of as a typical yellow, red, and blue. One of the strengths of the palette is that it does have black and can get very dark very quickly. But using too much pure black can be dangerous, as it's a color that dulls and sinks as it dries. So definitely have to be careful there. And here I like to mix it with the vermilion, warming it up, but also helping with the quality of that paint mixture a little bit. And generally, I found this palette to be really fun to use. And although every color is basically a mixture of all the colors on the palette, I found the mixing to be pretty intuitive and pretty simple. You kind of understand what you're going to get, and you can mostly get to the color that you want relatively quickly. It's definitely lacking in a few areas, especially a bright, vibrant yellow. Because of the yellow ochre, you're just never going to get that super vibrant, bright yellow. But it is a trade-off because the yellow ochre is super helpful for developing skin tones. And so is the vermilion. You know, it's a really great warming color. So it's definitely a palette that serves a portrait artist very well. But the huge problem comes with the blues. Because of the ivory black, which is technically a very dark blue, you're just never really going to get a bright, vibrant blue, just like the yellow, because the black is so desaturated. And even the dark blue, potentially with just the black, is super desaturated dark blue. So the blues are definitely something that you might struggle with, and you're going to have to rely a lot on it contrasting with warmer colors around it to make it feel like it's bluer than it really is. Now, with darker skin tones, it works really well also. I was worried initially because blue tends to be a really important color for a lot of dark skin tones, and I just wasn't convinced that the black was going to be able to fill its place But I was pleasantly surprised with a lot of the implied purples I was able to get by mixing it with the vermilion. And again, the vermilion and the yellow ochre work really well to warm things up, and they kind of create these more muted colors that are really pulling you towards realism. A lot of beginners, I feel like, build skin tones with very vibrant colors, and what they really need to do is desaturate things sometimes. And the palette is mostly made up of opaque paints, which really tend to be a lot more pleasant to use, especially when you're building up more highlighted areas. And it does miss some potential for transparency in the shadows without adding anything. But I feel like you're much worse off if your palette is mostly transparent rather than mostly opaque. So just a few quick bullet points of the pros and cons of this palette. It's got that great value range from the super dark ivory black all the way up to titanium white. You're definitely going to be able to mix all the values that you want out of this palette. And it's a strong palette for portraiture. With the yellow ochre and vermilion, it really lends itself well to being able to mix skin tones pretty quickly and effectively. And even the ivory black is a reasonable substitute for how you'd normally use a cooling color like blue when mixing skin tones. It's super fun to use. That is like the biggest plus for this palette, I think. It's very different than what most people would think of to use as a palette. And sometimes not having your comfortable sort of typical routes to take and being forced down another avenue is, a great way to lead you on a sort of new creative, interesting paths that you might not even think to look for. They say like limitation or conflict is like a great catalyst for creativity. And, the puzzling nature of this palette, the sort of having to figure out how to depict certain things or mix certain colors is, a really fun part of the palette. And for me is like a really fun part in painting in general, right? The sort of figuring it out nature is what I find most attractive in painting. As for the cons, it does have that limited range of blues. You're not going to get really true blues from this palette. And it's also missing that sort of upper end of the yellows, the super vibrant yellow. But it's important to note that these cons are, it's only from the point of view where you're looking for a new palette and you've set up parameters for yourself where you say, well, I want blues, I want a yellow. And, then these would represent themselves as, cons for this palette. But does it mean it's an ineffective palette? No, not at all, right? Because as long as you speak in the language of the palette, you use the world of the palette, you're going to be able to get to where you need to get to. And I think, that's one of the biggest lessons to take away from this experiment in general is that, it's not so much about carefully depicting reality exactly as it is, mixing colors perfectly, but rather translating them into the unique voice of the palette. And, it's something I say to myself all the time. Our jobs as painters is not to perfectly replicate everything that's going on in reality, but rather, translate it through our own voices, our own experiences into what we find interesting and, try and share that with other people. And this palette, I think, can kind of help you maybe tap into some of that. Now, all in all, a really fun, cool, interesting palette to use that is great for portraiture, but also really flexible. And because of its unique color limitations, can really unlock some creative use for you as an artist. Now, the next palette we'll look at is a fairly common one among oil painters and is essentially based around the additive primaries. It also happens to make up what I consider the base for my typical palette, which I use to paint just about every bit of realism. And it's comprised of titanium white, cadmium yellow light, cadmium red light, and ultramarine blue. Now, this palette is missing a black, a very dark value. And the best you're going to get is mixing the ultra blue with the cad red. And it's a great mixture, actually, for like a general deep shadow in portraits. And the blue is obviously quite dark, but it's also very obviously blue. So sometimes definitely important to mix it with the red. You can't just replace the black with blue and expect it to work every time. And it doesn't really create like a vibrant purple, as you might expect between red and blue. And rather, these specific pigments kind of work to desaturate each other, and you get more of a deep brown than anything. And although it's not like a true black, again, in the context of the whole, it's definitely enough to suggest that it is black if you structure your values appropriately and you're not comparing it directly to a true black. But even here, you can see, looking at the portrait next to it, which does contain black, there really isn't much of a difference that jumps out at you as alarming. And the mixing, again, super intuitive for this palette, very easy to understand. The colors all pretty much do exactly what you expect them to do. The purple between the red and blue being more brown, probably the most unexpected result you'll get out of these colors. Both the yellow and red are very powerful pigments, and they create wonderful skin tones. And the pure versions of these colors, or versions of these colors that have very little mixing, they're often very usable in certain situations. And that's definitely, a plus for this palette, I think. The ultramarine blue is one of my absolute favorite colors to use for dark skin tones. And I feel like that muted purple, when mixed with the red, is often just the color that I'm looking for. And I feel like it gives me a wider range of more chromatic or colorful browns to use, especially cooler ones with the blue than I would get with the black. And when there are cooler highlights, bluer highlights, you can see also how much more range you get with a truer blue. Again, controlling the values, really important here to make sure that you have a strong enough distance between the darkest values and the next ones, because you don't have a true black. So for instance, here, we can have no trouble reading this as black hair. So, bullet points for this palette. It's very versatile. Like I said, it's the palette that I use in pretty much everything. Every painting that I've posted here is, pretty much starting from these colors, except for the very obviously different color studies. But if I'm ever looking to paint something, realistic, I start with these colors and then kind of build out from there. So it's a great base set of colors to develop your own palette around if you're looking to do that. The pigments are super enjoyable and fun to use. The cad red and the cad yellow are really vibrant, very powerful, very fun to put down on the canvas. And, their consistency, depending on the brand, but their consistency is usually very pleasant, very buttery and stiff, and just a really satisfying paint. And, lots of opportunities to use them purely out of the tubes. Like sometimes if you're painting a portrait and there's light shining through somebody's ear, it's a great opportunity to look for cadmium red just straight out of the tube. It's just so satisfying to be able to put it down right away like that. The mixing is very intuitive. It's the additive primaries, and it pretty much functions like light would, to a degree, right? Like yellow and red make orange and so on and so forth. The one sort of, hiccup there would be the blue and the red don't really mix a purple necessarily. I mean, it's a kind of purple, but it's very dull and desaturated, more of what we would call a brown probably. So that would be the only hurdle to cross there when thinking about the ease of mixing. The cons, it does have a weak sort of low end of the value range, a very dark color is difficult to get here. The darkest you're going to get is that brown from the red and blue. But again, in the context of the palette itself, in the world of the palette, in the language of the palette, it does create a sufficiently dark enough color and desaturated enough to where it reads as a black. And it is missing some very specific areas of like the color range, and it's mostly in the darker cool reds and like a turquoise or teal, for instance. Even like a brighter cool red is difficult to get here. So again, if you're looking for those very specific holes to fill, they're going to be missed here in this palette. And I'll tell you, those are two colors that I usually add around these four colors to kind of build out the palette a little bit more. I'll add like a dark cool red, a alizarin crimson or something like that. And I'll have a cobalt teal on hand as well to kind of flesh out the palette a little bit more. So it's a great versatile palette that can be used for basically anything and gives you a great result and super fun to use. Also a very good palette for a beginner to potentially start learning from. Now, the final palette we'll look at is another really common, popular one among artists and machines. It's the CMY palette, which stands for cyan, magenta, and yellow. And for the yellow, I chose lemon yellow. For the magenta, I chose magenta. And for the cyan, I chose phthalo blue. Now, there's a lot of flexibility here, and a lot of people will sort of have their own ideas of what colors you should choose for this. And you could substitute anything, but like the other palettes, you could substitute anything as well. So I tried to stay as true to the name of the palette as possible. And the phthalo blue being the weirdest one, maybe, but when you mix it with white, it definitely gets you a very close approximation to cyan. You can get a very dark color here, mixing the blue and magenta together, like the previous palette, mixing the red and blue. But here, these colors don't desaturate each other so much, and you get a very vibrant purple in the end. So it's going to be hard to have a more desaturated black, but in most situations, having a chromatic or colorful black is actually great to have. Now, where the Zorn palette excelled at having a very wide value range, going all the way from black to white, this has a very good color range, maybe the best color range, and you can probably develop or mix the largest amount of unique colors from this palette as compared to the others. It's got a very vibrant range of yellows, a very vibrant and complete range of blues compared to the others, and even has a really deep, cool red, which all the other palettes were missing. But if you have any experience printing, you'll know that the one color that really lacks, that's the most difficult for common printers to handle, is a true red. And this is where color substitutions might really come in. You know, you could say, well, let's replace the magenta with something, and then we could approach a more true red. And as you can see here, you know, compared to the others, it's a much cooler portrait that's developing. And you may think like, well, oh, this is so wildly different. But really in my head, you know, as I'm painting it, I do feel that things are coming together well. And, you know, I really think just the comparison is what's leading it to stand out so much. And, you know, like this one is maybe too cool. The others might be a little bit too warm, right? So the answer probably lies more somewhere in between these. Now, the one thing that you might have to struggle with here is the amount of mixing, because like the Zorn palette, and maybe even to a greater degree, every color you put down here is going to be a mixture of everything on the palette. And there's also a danger to have too vibrant colors if you're not working to desaturate them, because when you mix one color with another, with any other color here, you know, you're going to end up with a vibrant mixture. So you're really going to need to add some third color in there to make sure you're desaturating things. Another thing about this palette is 2 of the 3 colors are transparent. So you don't get the satisfaction of having the, you know, being able to lay down pure opaque pigments for highlights as often. Pros and cons of this palette. It's got that wide color range. You know, it covers a greater area than probably the other 2 palettes do, right? You can mix more unique colors with this palette than the others, like we said. And it uniquely fills holes that are sort of present in the other colors, mostly in the sort of dark, cool red that the magenta covers, and then the upper end of the blues. Those are colors that are very difficult to mix in the other palettes, but here pretty effortless. The pigments are all very vibrant. You know, you're going to get a vibrant, every color mixed with every other color ends up with a vibrant result. You know, so it really takes 3 colors to kind of mix a convincing sort of realistic color, because, you know, there's the worry of being too vibrant, right? That feels sort of separated from reality. And it's got a good value range too. You know, the dark is very dark, although it's very chromatic, it's very purple. But it is super dark, and it does go all the way up to white, of course, so it's a good value range. You just have to worry about the temperature, controlling the temperature. As for the cons, it is missing a very true sort of warm red. And again, you know, this is where you could say, well, let's substitute something for the magenta. Like I said before, you know, maybe you could substitute rose, and that would help you approach a red, a more sort of true red. But it does always feel that it's missing something, there is something missing there in comparison's sake. And like I said, with the other 2 palettes, you know, in the world of the palette itself, you're going to be convinced and you're going to be fine with the color gamut, with the range of colors. But in comparison, that's when you start to understand that you're losing something there. And, you know, you're not going to be able to sort of have that satisfaction of using the pure pigments. Everything has to be mixed. And the mixing itself can be kind of a struggle at first, especially if you're new to mixing colors. You'll be working at a mixture for quite a while, sort of pushing and pulling back and forth, adding and taking away, or adding more of something else. And getting the right recipe is sometimes difficult with this palette, just because everything does have to be sort of a mixture of every color on the palette most of the time. But something that can also be really fun, I find mixing one of the funner parts of painting. I never pre-mix before I start painting, because for me, it's like part of the process, right? That's part of the enjoyment, is sort of mixing as I go along and sort of, feeling very reactive to myself painting when I'm mixing. But again, a really versatile palette with great range. That's a great choice if you're looking to thin out your palette, but still worried about maintaining certain colors, like a wide range of blues or a cool reds that you might lose with other palettes. So, what did we learn, Carl? Exactly. Whether you're a beginner looking for a place to start, or you're trying to simplify things, reduce the number of colors you're using, because let's be honest, a full palette in this economy, or you're looking for a palette that's easy to travel with, or you're just simply looking to try something new. There are so many awesome, wonderful, limited palette options out there, each with their own unique strengths and weaknesses. And I'd encourage you to give some of them a shot and see what they might unlock for you creatively. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I do hope to see you again in the future.